There is no Astor on the list of the richest Americans today. Not one. The great mansions are gone, torn down for office towers and a synagogue. The name survives on a hotel and almost nowhere else. And yet, for the better part of a century, the Astors were not just the richest family in America. They were the family that decided who counted. An invitation from Mrs. Astor was the line between belonging and not belonging in this country. They wrote the guest list for high society itself. So how does a family like that vanish from the very top? It started with one man. John Jacob Astor died in 1848, the richest man in the United States, with a fortune of around $20 million. That number sounds almost quaint now. But measured the honest way, against the size of the whole country, it was staggering. His fortune equaled close to 1% of the entire American economy. By that measure, the fair one, his money would rank well over $100 billion today, which places John Jacob Astor among the richest Americans who have ever lived. And within a few generations, his heirs would turn the greatest fortune in the country into scattered apartments and trust funds, with not much cash left to touch by the end. This is the story of the richest fortune this country ever produced, and how a family lost it without a single crash or scandal to blame, because the Astors did not gamble it away. What nobody at the very top of society understood, while they were busy deciding who else belonged there, was that the rot was already inside their own house. And the thing that destroyed them is the same quiet thing that erases most great fortunes, whether the number is $20 million or 200. But this story does not begin in a ballroom, or on the deck of the Titanic, or in any of the places the Astors are remembered. It begins with a poor German boy stepping off a boat with almost nothing and a plan to get rich on animal skins. The legend, and it is close to the truth, is that he came over with a few German flutes to sell and the clothes on his back. He learned the fur trade from the bottom, hauling pelts himself, sleeping rough, driving hard bargains with trappers who did not see the banker hiding inside the peddler. Within 20 years, the peddler owned the trade. Astor had one gift above all others: the ability to look at a thing everyone else saw as small and see the empire it could become. A pile of beaver skins was, to him, a shipping line. A shipping line was a fortune. And a fortune, he decided, was land. John Jacob Astor arrived in America in the 1780s, the son of a butcher, with little money and less English. He started in furs, buying pelts from trappers and traders and selling them into the markets of Europe and beyond. And he was ruthless about it. In 1808, he founded the American Fur Company, and then he did something that would define every great American fortune to come. He got the government on his side. A law in 1816 barred foreigners from the fur business on American soil, and another in 1822 shut down the government's own trading posts, and between them, they handed Astor something close to a monopoly. By the 1830s, his company ruled the American fur trade. He also built a fortune in the China trade, sending ships across the Pacific and bringing back goods that sold for fortunes back home. By any measure, he was a hard man to like. Astor squeezed his trappers, undercut his rivals, and pushed his fur company into every territory it could reach, with a cold patience that unnerved even his partners. When beaver hats went out of fashion and the animals grew scarce, other traders clung on and went broke. Astor read the room and walked away rich. That instinct, to see the top of a market and sell into it, is the same instinct that would build the second and greater half of his fortune. He did not fall in love with the thing that made him rich. He fell in love with staying rich. Here is the part that shows the mind of the man. At the height of the fur business, when the money was pouring in, Astor got out. He could see that fashions change and animals run scarce, and he wanted something that would never run out and never go out of style. He wanted land, and not just any land. He wanted Manhattan. Starting in the 1830s, Astor poured his fortune into New York City real estate, and he did it with a strategy so simple and so patient that it is still taught today. He bought raw land at the edge of the growing city, farmland, and empty lots the grid had not yet reached, and he bought it cheap. Then he waited. As the city marched north, as it always would, that cheap farmland became priceless blocks in the middle of the fastest growing city on earth. Astor is supposed to have said that if he could live his life again, he would buy every foot of land on the island of Manhattan. He almost did. And here is the genius of it, the engine that would make the family rich for generations. Astor did not sell the land, he leased it. He would rent a plot on a long lease, often around 21 years, and let someone else pay to put up a building on it. The Astors collected the rent and owned the ground the whole time. And when the lease ran out, the building itself reverted to the Astors, who could then charge far more or take the structure for a fraction of its worth. They captured the rising value of the greatest city in America without lifting a finger over and over forever. By the 1840s, the rent from around 470 leases brought in something like $200,000 a year by contemporary accounts, and it kept climbing with the city. When John Jacob Astor died in 1848, he was the richest man in America and the first great multimillionaire the country had ever produced. But watch what he did with the fortune at the very end, because it is the one moment the family got it right, and the reason it held together for even one more generation. Astor had a problem common to dynasties. His eldest son was not able to run the empire. So Astor broke with the custom of dividing a fortune among all the children and passed the great bulk of it to his second son, William Backhouse Astor, keeping the empire in one pair of capable hands. That single decision, keeping the fortune whole instead of slicing it up, is the thing that mattered most. And it is the exact thing his descendants would forget how to do. William Backhouse Astor became known as the landlord of New York. He did not squander what his father left him. He grew it, buying more property, adding to the leases, and by the time he died in 1875, he had more than doubled the fortune to something near $100 million, and made the Astors the largest private landowners in New York City. By one count in the 1860s, William Backhouse Astor owned more than 700 houses in Manhattan and topped every list of the wealthiest men in the city, sitting millions of dollars ahead of whoever came second. He was not a builder or an inventor. He was a collector of rent on a scale no American had ever managed. The human embodiment of the machine his father made. And that is the quiet turning point, though nobody saw it then. The founder had been a hunter. His son was a caretaker. A very good caretaker, but a caretaker all the same. 2 generations in, the family sat on top of the richest city in the country, collecting rent from a huge slice of it. Nothing could touch them. And that is when they stopped counting their money and started counting each other. Because the next chapter of the Astor story is not about business at all. It is about a ballroom. This decision to trade empire building for social ruling seemed small at the time. It was not. Enter Mrs. Astor. Caroline Webster Schermerhorn. Astor, the wife of a grandson of the founder, decided that being the richest family in America was not enough. The Astors would also be the most important family, the arbiters of who did and did not belong in polite society. And in the Gilded Age, when new industrial fortunes were exploding all over the country and threatening to swamp the old families, that was a throne worth seizing. Caroline Astor made herself the Queen of New York society, known to everyone as the Mrs. Astor. To hold that throne, she built a machine of exclusion as deliberate as her ancestors' machine of rent. She threw an annual ball in January that became the single most important event of the social season, and an invitation to it was a kind of knighthood. Miss it, and you learned you did not exist. The whole system ran on a simple threat. New money was flooding into New York, railroad money, steel money, oil money, and all of it wanted respectability. Caroline Astor was the woman who could grant that respectability or withhold it, and for a while the richest strivers in America danced to her tune to get it, and the money went into showing it off. The Astors and their rivals built a canyon of marble mansions up Fifth Avenue, each one grander than the last, staffed by armies of servants, thrown open a few nights a year for balls that cost more than most Americans earned in a lifetime. It was the most conspicuous display of wealth the country had ever seen. It was also, though nobody said so out loud, the sound of a fortune being spent rather than grown. Every dollar poured into a ballroom was a dollar not buying the next block of the growing city. The Astors had stopped playing offense and started playing dress-up. Her enforcer was a man named Ward McAllister, a social climber who appointed himself the referee of high society. Together they came up with the idea that would make them famous: the 400. McAllister told a newspaper in 1888 that there were only about 400 people in New York who mattered, the only ones at ease in fashionable society. Everyone else was, by definition, nobody. Now you have heard the reason for that number, or some version of it. The story goes that 400 was the exact count of how many people fit inside Mrs. Astor's ballroom. It is a great story. It is also a myth. Historians cannot trace the number to her ballroom at all, and the origin is a mystery. Almost nobody has heard the other half of the story either. When McAllister at last published his official list of the 400 in the New York Times in 1892, it did not even have 400 names on it. It had fewer, some of them misspelled, some of them dead. The press had a field day and started calling him McAllister. The most exclusive list in America could not count to 400. But the power was real, even if the number was a joke. And the sharpest example of that power is the night the Astors collided with the family that would one day take their crown: the Vanderbilts. The Vanderbilts had more money than almost anyone, a railroad and shipping fortune, but to Mrs. Astor they were new money, vulgar, not fit for the 400. So in 1883, Alva Vanderbilt threw the most lavish costume ball New York had ever seen and made it the event of the season. Then she let it be known that Mrs. Astor's own daughter, who had been rehearsing a dance for the party for weeks, would not receive an invitation because, Alva explained, Mrs. Astor had never once called on the Vanderbilts, so the two families were not acquainted. To get her daughter into that ballroom, the Queen of New York society was forced to swallow her pride and leave her calling card at the Vanderbilt mansion, the formal act of recognition. And just like that, the Vanderbilts were in. Think about that for a second. The most exclusive door in America opened, and the family that opened it was the very family the Astors would soon be measured against and lose to. The gatekeepers had let in the people who would outlast them. While Caroline Astor was refereeing dinner parties, something far more dangerous was happening inside her own family, and it started of all places with a fight over her name. There were, by the 1890s, two women who each believed she was the rightful Mrs. Astor: Caroline, the reigning queen, and Mary, the wife of William Waldorf-Astoria, who held the single largest share of the family fortune. The two branches feuded over the title with a bitterness that is hard to imagine today. And William Waldorf-Astoria, rich beyond counting and sick of losing a social war to his aunt, did something no Astor had ever done. He gave up on America. In 1891, William Waldorf-Astoria packed up the largest single pool of the family's wealth and moved to England. America, he announced, was no longer a fit place for a gentleman to live. He became a British subject. He bought Cliveden, one of the great English country houses, and later Hever Castle, the childhood home of Anne Boleyn, and poured money into both. In time, the British crown would make him a lord, a viscount. Remember this decision, because it looks at first like a rich man sulking off in a huff. It was the smartest financial move anyone in the family would make for 100 years, and nobody knew it yet. He did not leave without a splash. He became more English than the English, restoring Hever Castle down to a mock Tudor village, filling Cliveden with treasures, and buying his way toward the title he craved. Back home, Americans mocked him as a snob who had turned his back on the country that made his family rich. What they missed was the structure he was stepping into. The British aristocracy was, whatever else it was, a centuries-old machine for keeping land and money in one family's hands across the generations, passed whole to a single heir, instead of split among many. William Waldorf-Astoria had not just fled a social feud, he had walked his share of the fortune into the one system on Earth built to preserve it. Meanwhile, back in New York, the two feuding branches found a way to insult each other in the most expensive manner possible. William Waldorf, before he left, tore down his Fifth Avenue mansion, the one right next to his Aunt Caroline's, and built a hotel on the spot, in part to loom over her home and ruin her view. It was called the Waldorf. Not to be outdone, Caroline's son, John Jacob Astor IV, tore down his mother's mansion after she moved uptown and built an even taller hotel right beside it, the Astoria. The two hotels were joined together into one, the Waldorf-Astoria, with a long marble corridor between them, and a clause in the agreement that the corridor could be bricked up if the cousins ever fell out again. The richest family in America was now so busy fighting itself that its members were demolishing their own palaces to spite one another, and the hotels themselves tell you how the family had changed. John Jacob Astor, the first, would never have torn down a money-making asset to win an argument with a relative. He bought and held and let the value pile up. His descendants tore down mansions to build spite hotels next to each other, then negotiated a clause about a hallway. The energy that had once gone into cornering the fur trade and buying Manhattan now went into cornering the best table at dinner. The family still had the money. What it had lost was the hunger and the discipline that made the money in the first place. On a cold night in 1912, John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man aboard, was a passenger on the maiden voyage of the Titanic. When the ship went down, he was lost with it. His young wife Madeline survived, and months later gave birth to his son. His fortune, something like $85 million, passed for the most part to his son Vincent, who was about 20 years old and now, in an instant, one of the richest men in the world. And Vincent Astor did something his ancestors would never have understood. He started selling. The world the Astor fortune was built for was ending. That old system of leasing out slum tenements looked worse every year. The Great Depression hammered the family's holdings in the Theater District and Times Square. And Vincent, to his credit, could see that the passive rent machine his family had coasted on for generations was running down. So he sold. He sold off huge pieces of the empire that 4 generations had assembled. To be fair to Vincent, selling may have been the smart move. Holding a fortune in one city's slum tenements through the Depression was a losing bet, and he got out of a lot of it before it cratered. But smart or not, every sale was a subtraction. Each block sold was a block that would never again throw off Astor rent, a piece of the machine traded for one-time cash that then got spent or split or taxed. The family that had spent a century buying Manhattan and never selling was now selling Manhattan and never buying. The whole direction of the enterprise had reversed, and once a fortune starts flowing out instead of in, the end is only a matter of time, and the land the family had sworn never to part with was going on the block. The mansions went too. The Astor Double Chateau on Fifth Avenue, one of the grandest homes ever built in the city, was pulled down in the 1920s, and a synagogue, Temple Emmanuel, stands on the spot today. That original Waldorf-Astoria, the monument to the family feud, was demolished in 1929 to make room for the Empire State Building. One by one, the physical proof that the Astors had ruled New York was erased from the skyline. Because the deepest problem was not the sold buildings or the fallen mansions. It was that there was no longer anyone building anything and no structure holding what was left together. And it all came to a head with Vincent Astor's own death. Vincent Astor died in 1959, and he died with no children. An illness in his youth had left him unable to have them. So the main line of the greatest fortune in America just ran out of Astors. Vincent left the bulk of what remained not to his relatives, but to a charitable foundation, the Vincent Astor Foundation. His own half-brother, John Jacob Astor VI, contested the will, fought for a piece of the family fortune, and walked away with the settlement of $250,000, $250,000, from a fortune that had once equaled 1% of the United States. That is the kind of number that tells you the story is already over. Vincent had spent his life as the last real steward of the fortune, and he seems to have known the family game was up. He poured much of what remained into charity rather than heirs, funding hospitals, parks, and the New York Public Library through his foundation. You can read that as generosity, and it was. You can also read it as a verdict, a man who looks at his own family and decides the money will do more good with strangers as a man who has given up on the dynasty. The Astor name would go on. The fortune as a force in American life ended with him. So where did it all go? Not to a villain, not to a con man or a market crash. It leaked away, generation by generation, through a hole the family never bothered to plug. Here is the mechanism, and it is worth understanding because it is the thing that kills almost every great fortune without a sound. John Jacob Astor was a builder. He hunted, he schemed, he took enormous risks, and he made a machine that printed money. But his descendants inherited that machine and stopped being builders. They became collectors. They lived on the rent and stopped hunting for more. Their days went to deciding who could come to dinner
instead of figuring out what came after Manhattan real estate. A fortune that is not being rebuilt is just being spent, a little at a time, no matter how big it starts. And underneath that was the deeper flaw, the real killer. The Astors never built a structure to hold the fortune together. The founder had done it once, by instinct, when he handed the empire to a single capable son. But that was a one-time decision, not a system. After him, every generation split the money among more and more children, and each of those children split it again. There was no family trust to hold the assets as one block. No holding company, no family office running the whole fortune as a single enterprise across the generations. So the pile that started as $100 million got carved into ever smaller pieces, taxed at every death, drained by the upkeep on illiquid land, until a family that once owned New York was, as one account put it, land rich and cash poor, with heirs holding trust funds and apartments instead of an empire. When 50 descendants split what one or two should have held, a giant fortune becomes a comfortable one, and then just a memory. And the taxes finished what the dividing started. When the federal estate tax arrived, it took a bite out of the fortune at every single death, and in a family that was dividing anyway, that meant a bite out of every shrinking slice. Land that generated prestige but little cash had to be sold just to pay the tax on the person who had died. So the heirs were not only getting smaller shares, they were selling assets to keep the government paid. A fortune built to compound forever was now doing the opposite, shrinking a little with every funeral, and nobody was there to stop it because nobody was in charge of the whole. That is the thing a trust, or a holding company, or a family office is built to do. It puts one hand on the entire fortune and says, this stays together, no matter how many heirs are born, no matter how foolish or greedy any one of them turns out to be. The Astors never gave anyone that hand. Every heir was captain of his own shrinking slice, free to spend it, sell it, or lose it, and answerable to no one. 100 captains, each steering his own little boat in his own direction, none of them answering to anyone, and no fleet anywhere in sight. That is not how you keep an empire. That is how you lose one. But here's the twist that turns this from a sad story into a lesson. Because one branch of the very same family did it right. And they are still rich today. Remember William Waldorf-Astoria, the one who stormed off to England in a huff in 1891? That branch, the British Astors, did every single thing the American branch failed to do. And the difference is almost a controlled experiment. The same family, the same money, two very different endings. First, they used the British aristocracy as a wealth machine. When William Waldorf became a Viscount, the title itself forced the fortune to hold together, because a peerage and the estates attached to it passed to one heir, not split among all the children. The English system did on purpose what John Jacob Astor had done once by accident. It kept the fortune whole generation after generation. There's a hard irony in that. The Americans had fought a revolution partly to be rid of lords and inherited titles and entailed estates, the whole machinery of aristocracy that locks wealth inside a bloodline. And it was exactly that machinery, embraced by the branch that crossed the ocean, that saved the British Astors while the free and equal American branch dissolved. The thing the New World was proudest of escaping turned out to be very good at one particular job, keeping a family rich forever. Second, they protected the crown jewels. The family handed Clive-Edin, the great estate, to the National Trust in 1942, along with one of the largest endowments the trust had ever received, more than £250,000, while keeping the right to live there. The house was preserved forever, put out of reach of division and death taxes in a single stroke. Hever Castle passed down intact. The assets were locked in, not carved up. Compare that to what was happening in New York at the very same time. There, the Astor mansions were meeting the wrecking ball, the leases were being sold for cash, and the fortune was being sliced at every death. In England, the same family was doing the exact opposite, nailing its treasures down so hard that a house given away in wartime is still standing, still endowed, still tied to the Astor name almost a century later. Two branches of one family ran the same experiment with the same money at the same moment in history and got opposite results. There is no cleaner proof anywhere that it is the structure, not the size of the pile, that saves a fortune. Third, they built the very thing the Americans never did, a holding company, a structure to own the estates and pass the benefit to the next generation as one unit, on purpose, with lawyers and a plan. The result. Today, the current Viscount Astor, the descendant of the man everyone thought had rage quit America, was valued a few years ago at close to $300 million, still living on the family estates, still at the center of British public life. One branch of the family sits in the House of Lords and hosts prime ministers. The other branch, the American one, the branch that was richer and grander and mightier than any of them at the start, is a name on a hotel and a subway stop. Same blood, same starting fortune. The only thing that differed was whether they built a wall around the money or let it sit out in the open, and time did the rest. That is the whole distance between the Astors of England and the Astors of New York. That is the whole lesson, and it is not about the Astors at all. The families that keep their fortunes are almost never the ones with the most money. They are the ones with the best plumbing. The DuPonts kept theirs by holding the company together through trusts for 5 generations. The Rockefellers kept theirs with a family office and dynasty trusts that still guard billions across more than 150 heirs. That pattern is always the same. Families that endure treat the fortune like an institution, with rules, trustees, and a plan that outlives any single heir's judgment or appetite. The ones that fade treat it like a personal bank account, to be enjoyed now and divided later. It is not about being frugal, and it is not about being clever. The Astors were plenty clever. It is about building something that holds the money together after the person who made it is gone, so that no one weak or greedy or unlucky heir can drain the whole pool. The Astors, kings of the greatest city on earth, never bothered to build it. It is a repeatable playbook, and the American Astors, the richest of them all, are the cautionary tale of what happens when you skip it. They had the most money in America, and they still lost it, because a fortune with no structure is just a countdown. So think back to where we started, to the family that decided who belonged in America. The final irony is almost too perfect. The Astors spent a generation drawing up the list of who mattered in this country, and today it is their own name that has slipped off the only list that still measures the thing they cared about most. The gatekeepers got locked out. But if you want to see this pattern in its purest, cruelest form, you have to look at the family the Astors let through the door despite themselves that night in 1883, the Vanderbilts. Because Cornelius Vanderbilt died the richest man in America, with a fortune larger than the United States Treasury held at the time, and within a single lifetime of his death, at a family reunion of 120 of his descendants, there was not one millionaire in the room. Think about the speed of that. The Astors took a century and change to fade from the top. The Vanderbilts managed the same collapse in a couple of generations, burning through the largest fortune in the country so fast that grandchildren born into palaces died having outlived the money. Same disease, division and spending, and no structure, but a far quicker death. If the Astors faded, the Vanderbilts fell off a cliff. And that story is next.